Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cisco Optics podcast, where we talk about optics for networking. What are the industry's technical experts in pluggable optics thinking about today? What are the technical boundaries that the smartest minds are pushing past to make the next generation of high-speed optics? If you're wondering about this, we have just the person for you. This is episode 5, where we start a new conversation with my esteemed colleague, Mark Noel. Dr. Noel is a Cisco fellow, and for good reason. In my 8.5 years at Cisco, I've known him to be a highly respected and influential leader not only at Cisco, but the entire optics industry. We begin the conversation with his own background a bit, and then we explore a brief history of standards in pluggable optics. Mark Noel is a Cisco fellow in Cisco's Optics and Optical Systems group. His focus is on next-generation interconnect technology innovation to meet Cisco's needs. Mark is also active within the industry standards and forums and has chaired multiple IEEE 802.3 Ethernet projects. He represents Cisco on various industry alliances and consortiums. Mark also chairs a number of industry multi-source agreement groups focusing on next-generation optical module form factors such as QSFP-DD and QSFP-DD 800, and optical interface signaling technology like the 100G Lambda MSA. See, I told you we had the right person. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast. It may show up as the Cisco Podcast Network, which has other great podcast series as well. Check out our blog at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics Blog, all one word, no hyphen and no spaces. For our YouTube playlist, go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. And for product information, go to cisco.com/go/optics. And now, join me as I talk with Mark Noel. Hey, Mark. How you doing?
Hey, Pat. How you doing? I'm good.
Great. Thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate all the time you've set aside for this.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to it.
So I thought to get started for listeners, if we could just kind of maybe go through a little bit about your background, maybe describe your career. I tried to do some research online. Your LinkedIn page is extremely impressive, but also pretty brief, like not a lot of detail. I know that you are a pioneer of pluggable optics, and you have been a driving force in standards bodies. Is there anything you can elaborate on that, maybe early in your career, where you got started and some of the things that you accomplished?
Yeah, I'm an old guy, so I've done a lot of things. I wouldn't say I'm a pioneer on pluggable optics, but I certainly spent a lot of time on those topics. I think
that's a matter of perspective. Some people would disagree with that.
Well, I know the ones that'll disagree, but I've been with Cisco for more than 20 years. Before that, I was doing grad work. I did a PhD. I worked for Hewlett Packard Research Labs, all in the optics domain. So I knew how to spell optics fairly well.
You did your PhD. I saw on your LinkedIn page. Yep. Not just anywhere.
Cambridge in England. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting place.
So how was that?
It was an interesting place. It's different. It was a lot of very smart people, and but a lot of very unique people. Right? So
yeah, and then also across the pond, things are a bit different over there in general, right?
Yeah, I'm actually born British.
Oh, really?
My family moved to Canada when I was 9 years old. So I've always had both sides of that. So it was interesting going back as a sort of an adult and re-experiencing it. So, Cambridge was a really interesting experience. A lot of smart people there, and I'm still in contact with a lot of them.
Cool.
Yeah. But I joined Cisco coming in as really an optics person. And back then that was, we were worrying about, the really high speed sort of bleeding edge stuff was 10 gigabit. And
approximately what year was this, or what range of years?
Oh, that was peak of the bubble. So sort of 99.
Okay.
And and while optics was interesting and important, and I enjoyed it, it was very clear that for what the most of Cisco did at the time, building switches and routers, that optics was not an afterthought, but it wasn't the primary thing. And so, from a career point of view, if you wanted to take opportunity, you got into doing other things. So, I for whatever reason, they felt I knew what I was doing, so I got put in charge of various teams, and so through this 20 years or so, I've had a chance to lead board design teams, mechanical engineering teams, thermal teams, ASIC development teams, pretty much every function involved in hardware, in the hardware aspects, right, including architecture teams. So what it means is I've met a lot of really smart people. I've watched the engine and how we do and build products, and it's given me a great kind of breadth of experience, and with enough knowledge to be dangerous in a lot of different areas.
So that breadth, that exposure to multiple teams and disciplines, does that give you a perspective that you think your respective teammates may not have? Now that you've seen multiple...
that's hard to say. A lot of people have a lot of knowledge, right? That's one thing I'm just fascinated by in my career is just the people that you meet and how much knowledge people have, right? And that you just don't know what they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and they will always surprise you with just great ideas or just great insights, right? So I just consider myself lucky.
I didn't know right? I never knew you were originally British. So there you go.
Yeah, well, at a certain age, you have to lose your accent quickly in the schoolyard, or so.
It's just like when you look up like your favorite actor on some American TV show, and then you realize, oh my gosh, they're actually British. It happens to me like every other week.
It's where all the good things come from, I tell you. Yeah.
So Cisco at 20 years, wow, that's amazing. Can you also tell us a little bit about all the activity and leadership that you've shown in the standards bodies? Because I know that's a big part of what you've been doing since I've been at Cisco, at least.
Yeah, well, before I joined Cisco, I was working for HP Labs at the time, and HP was had a lot of optics and a lot of work. Anyway, I got sucked into doing a lot of work in the Ethernet standards body back then, and that was gigabit Ethernet. So I learned my way around how that process works, and learned a lot. My boss at the time was very skilled in the politics, so he sort of opened my eyes to some of the things that were going on, as well as the technology that we were trying to push. And so I learned a lot from that. And when I came into Cisco, one of the things with networking and specifically with optics is it always has to interoperate with something else. The standards are very important. Mm-hmm. And so everything you need to do has to be standardized, unless you're going off and doing something proprietary, which is not impossible, but things are much easier if everyone's part works with everyone else's. So standards has always been there. And so I while I was at Cisco, I stayed involved with watching it and tracking it, trying to influence it. As Ethernet kind of shifted to 40 gig and 100 gig, I got more involved while doing all these other things. So I kind of had my foot in both sides, on the development side, as well as trying to influence what I could as a kind of a contributor into the standards. And so as optics became much more of an issue in how we build our products, and much more central to how we put our products together, my focus shifted. It kind of narrowed back down within Cisco to kind of the optical domain. We got quite active in the standards, of course, but also we acquired a company called Lightwire, which is one of the first acquisitions to Silicon Photonics. So I was very involved in that and working closely with that team. And from that, my focus within Cisco has narrowed to really concentrating on the optical interconnect technologies and everything that goes around that. And we'll be talking more about sort of the system aspects of that later. But and with that, I kind of got sucked into some leadership roles within the standards body. So I started out by becoming a chair of 25 gigabit Ethernet, and since then I suppose it was one before that, but it was a smaller one. But I've now led for the IEEE task forces through to completion. So 25 gigabit Ethernet, 50 gigabit Ethernet, and the 100 gig Lambda stuff. And there was a small project on 40 gig a long time ago.
That's awesome.
Well, it's quite. It takes a lot of effort and time, but it's again, it's fun watching how you take a room full of 100 or 200 engineers and get them to all agree on something. It's quite. I really enjoy that process.
Really, I think some people would find it quite painful.
Well, I mean,
face that task.
It's there is a lot of pain involved as well. Yeah, and getting the final document out does take a long time. But one of the transitions that we've had in the industry is the standards have been very, like especially the Ethernet standard. It's kind of like the bedrock. It's the foundational document that everything is built upon. And the IEEE does an absolutely fantastic job with their process on getting these to be rock solid specifications. So you never think about interop when you plug, back in the olden days when we plug cables into our laptops, you never worried about it working. It just always worked. And that was down to the quality of the work that group does. But the downside is it does take a long time. And that thoroughness has a sort of a tax associated with it.
I mean, it's a fundamental trade-off, right?
It is.
Quality work is just going to take longer, right?
And yeah, and also getting that room of 100 people to agree does take longer, right? So one of the things that has always been there, but has really kind of risen to the fore in maybe the last 5 years or so is the creation of these collaborative entities called consortiums or multi-source agreements, where things like the standards maybe define something, but they don't actually define the implementation. And so we use these MSAs to go and define implementations like the form factors, the pluggable modules themselves, like what is the mechanical shape and size and dimensions, and what do those what do the contact pads look like, and all those details to guarantee that I can plug some module in. And so these MSAs have now really taken off in the industry, and there's multiple of them, and I chair a number of them, and I participate in a number of them, and it's really just an accelerated collaborative form, which is becoming very important to the industry right now.
Now, why do you think this has become a thing in recent years? What has changed that makes these MSAs more?
Part of it is competitive. Part of it's competitive, right? If you want to do something quickly, the best thing to do is only include the people that agree with you, right? And go with a smaller group. And so that's one of the motivations for an MSA. The second one is just speed. You're not, as a group, you can move as quickly as you want to move, and you can say the spec is done when you say it's done. And so you are able to move quicker in these groups. And those are probably the two main motivations. you do get into, unfortunately, as I mentioned, you get into competitive situations like we've seen recently in the last 4 or 5 years with the form factors on the pluggables. We've had QSFP-DD, which I'm actually the chair of that MSA, along with Scott from Molex. And there's a competitive form factor out there called OSFP, and it's unfortunate that this happened, but it happened, and the market will decide at the end of the day. But each MSA, and then there's a lot of companies that are members of both, because a lot of companies are unfortunately having to build both. So it's not ideal, but again, it's based on competitive issues, and some companies think one thing's more important than other aspects, and that bifurcates. So
we've seen in the past that the market really does decide, right? Like what comes to mind is like CWM4, and there was a competing MSA, right? I forgot the name of it already.
Well, yeah, CWM4 was an MSA itself, right? The standard was LR4. LR4 was the IEEE.
But there was another MSA that was also 2 kilometers, 100 gig.
Oh, back then I think there were maybe 5 MSAs that were.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was.
I was thinking one other. So,
well, to the point of, get a group of companies that agree with you to go do something. I think in that early days of 100 gigabit, when IEEE had done its work, there were a lot of companies that have alternate ideas. So a bunch of them banded together. I forget them all now, but there was a 10 by 10 MSA. There was, I can't remember them all, but there were a bunch. But the one that rose out of it is the CWM4 MSA, which is up until recently been the dominant thing for 100 gig. Mm-hmm. And so they are, I think the MSAs are very useful, but it is the market that decides at the end of the day is what will customers adopt, right? So if you're adding value, then they're successful, and it's just a quick way of iterating. But again, it's like a standards body, and from a leadership perspective, you're taking a bunch of people and trying to move them towards decisions as quickly as you can. So, I spend my time doing that as well.
All right, so enough of history. What has been on your mind? That was the first part of my conversation with Mark Noel. Next time we'll get into a topic that has been on his mind recently. Subscribe to this podcast, and we'd really appreciate you helping to get the word out. Share this with friends and colleagues that come to mind when you think of networking technology and optics. And leave a review on Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes. We're also on all the other major podcast platforms. You may see the Cisco Podcast Network come up when you search for a Cisco Optics podcast. That's just where we live, and you can find other great podcasts there too. Also, check out the Cisco Optics blog at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics blog with no spaces and no hyphens. We also have educational videos on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. Thank you for listening. This is Pat Chow, Product Manager at Cisco Optics. The next episode is part 2 of my conversation with Mark Noel. Until next time.